Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever Post Millennial podcast. We have with us today an extremely exciting guest. He is the associate editor of The Spectator. He founded the Centre for Social Cohesion, which later turned into the Henry Jackson Society. And most importantly, he has recently written two extremely wonderful books, The Strange Death of Europe, and now, more recently, The Madness of Crowds. So, I suppose a good place to start is looking at the title. So what exactly is this madness and how has it occurred?
Well, first, it's very good to be with you. Very nice to be in Montreal, and I'm glad that we wore the same uniform for the occasion. So the madness of crowds is my best run at what I think is the deranging attitude of our times. That is the way in which everything to do with individual identity has become weaponized and politicized. Everything to do with LGBT, everything to do with women, particularly relations between the sexes, everything to do with race. And as I say in the introduction to the Madness of Crowds, to me it has looked in recent years like seeing a set of rights claims which had basically got to the desired destination, equality. Watching that train drawing into the station it was desired to draw into, and just as it looked like it was stopping, suddenly gets ahead of steam, goes shooting off down the tracks, takes off the tracks, and takes out a whole set of people in its wake. And this is a shorthand for what I think is going on all the time. It's why every day's news is undergirded with stories about what somebody said or is alleged to have said about one of these issues. The best way, or let me put it this way, the best way to have a conversation, it seems, is not to actually have a conversation or discussion or dialectic. It's to hope that you can implausibly or otherwise portray one of your opponents as having nicked one of these tripwires so that you can accuse them of one of the phobias that follow on from it. And your generation is, of course, all over this game. And game it is, but I urge people to get off it because, among other things, the reasons I lay out in the book, it's a totally unwinnable game.
Well, you say that it comes from our generation. Is that cause to dismiss it? That it largely comes from hormonal undergraduates? Or
No, absolutely not. I mean, because, well, first of all, I should say the groundwork had been laid by an older generation. The intellectual groundwork, such as it is, and it's not very much for reasons we might get into, but the intellectual underpinnings, such as they are, were provided in the 1970s and 1980s onwards by a set of academics at various American academies in particular. And I simply think that it's this generation at the moment, your generation, that has decided to run with it, largely because a lot of your generation have been told to run with it, advised to run with it, or, and this is perhaps the most common bit, told that they will find meaning if they do run with this, that they will find purpose in their lives, and also that this is the way to demonstrate that you're a good person. I mean, you can tell me this, but my perception is that if you audition all the time to show that you are anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-misogynist, and pro-LGBT, every single bit of the rainbow, all the time, you're a good person. I think it's a lot more complex than that.
yes, and it's managed to grow exponentially. It started off in these liberal academies in the States, and now it can infiltrate even the most antiquated office of state or institution.
Yes.
If I may raise an example, I'm not sure how closely you followed the Canadian election, but Justin Trudeau happened to wear blackface a few decades ago.
Word got out.
Yes. And when he went to apologise, he talked about the systematic racism of Canada.
Right.
And the fact that it was his white privilege rather than his responsibility.
Yeah, that's a good way to get out of it, is to smear the responsibility so far and so wide and so thin that no one's really responsible.
Yes.
Particularly, coincidentally, yourself. Yes, that was an interesting one, by the way. The Justin Trudeau blackface, because I mean you're probably all rather bored of talking about it here, but I would just suggest that if it had emerged shortly before the American election that Donald Trump had regularly donned blackface, not just for nights out, but apparently so often that perhaps just often just for a nice, quiet, relaxing night in, it would have come out and it would have been used against him, and people would not have allowed a general spreading around of this. So why do I mention this? Because this reveals something that most of us have intuited for some time, which is perhaps this isn't actually about what it's pretending to be about. Perhaps, for instance, the extraordinary attention paid whenever anyone anywhere has worn blackface is actually not about, or at least not only about, an objection to that. It is about taking out your political enemies.
Yeah.
And specifically, the assumption is, I can use this on people from the right because they're the sort of people who are going to go around to parties all the time blacked up, aren't they? Because we know they're racists, and this is just a really good way to catch them out. One of your own guys has done it. Well, that's different. That's different, apparently. And this is important because all of these things are certainly by some people, what proportion we don't know, but certainly by some people at this stage, purely about brute politics and winning a political war.
Yes. We talked a lot about a loss of meaning. And it seems to me what unites both the strange death of Europe and the madness of the crowds is that it both derives from a loss of grand narratives.
Yes.
And I was wondering, what grand narratives have we lost exactly? Are they recoverable?
Well, the grand narratives, I can do them in order. The main grand narrative of a society like Britain, where I'm from, or Canada, where we're currently sitting, the main grand narrative that's fallen is religion. One can reject this. One can be saddened by this or thrilled by it, but I think it's pretty hard to deny it at this stage. That where, for instance, the Christian narrative existed in a country like Britain or Canada, it's been withdrawing for an awfully long time, more than a century. You could say a century and a half. That's a very big narrative to dwindle, and a set of other narratives fall in the wake of that. I think the 20th century's grand political narratives, broadly speaking, fell apart, mainly for good, by the end of the 20th century. And we have been for 30 years or so now in this slightly uncomfortable position in the West, where perhaps for the first time in human history we don't have any explanation at all for what we're meant to be doing here.
Yes.
That's a big gap. That's not just like not having anyone to fill the position of Transport Commissioner in the Greater Montreal area. That's a biggie. That's a real biggie. And into that gap, all sorts of things have tried to make an entry. I'd say that it's fairly obvious that the green movements have got a lot of wind recently because of speaking into this void. I'm not making a comment about the science, but just that an awful lot of people seem to find meaning now in proclaiming the end times, calling the world to repentance, and
Yes.
much more. It's a pretty good narrative, actually. They've got, it's almost entirely Christianity without Christ. But there are others as well, and my view is that the intersectional identity politics narrative is basically one of the most audacious, perhaps the most audacious attempt to step into this void that we've seen. You can find meaning in your life. It involved in politicizing everything and winning wars on minority rights issues that will keep coming up. Oh, and also fighting the fascists who are apparently always around the corner and under every bed and so on.
Yeah.
That this is the meaning of life. And I just, for reasons I explain in the book, I urge people not to do this.
And it is almost religious in the way it attempts to explain everything.
Yeah.
It leaves nothing untouched. And that's...
Well, it's more than that. It claims to be able to touch and solve everything.
Yeah.
That's a pretty audacious claim, but that's... The intersectionalist is a horrible, ugly word. I wish I could stop using it. I wish I could just come up with a more attractive word for this horrible idea, but maybe the word gives away the idea. The intersectionalists claim that we live in this interlocking oppressions, so that if you address one oppression, you address the others as well. So if you address racism in society, it's not enough just to address racism. You've got to address the position of black women in society, and then black trans women in society, and more, because you've got to unlock them simultaneously. And they're very unclear about what happens if we were to reach this grand unlocking, other than some kind of universal justice of some kind that we're not quite clear about what it would look like. But then utopians almost never describe utopia, because some people might say they don't like the sound of it.
And you also suggest in the book that a lot of this was precipitated after the 2008 financial crisis.
Yes.
Why?
Well, it's my view that when we look historically, when the economics goes wrong, we know that other things go wrong. It's not just the case that the economics goes wrong and it's segmented into a fragment of society which doesn't touch the others. Whenever the economy goes wrong, other things happen. And one thing that seems to me is you become vulnerable to bad ideas. Something about the societal immune system can go weak. And it's people have been trying to work out for a while, why have these identity issues been so rancid, in particular in the last 5 to 10 years? I chart this. You can actually show this with internet searches, among other things. Eric Weinstein has done this. In the last 10 years, these issues all start to flood in, and in the last 5 years, they all become highly weaponized. So there are terms which people simply didn't use before, which are now everywhere. Heteronormative, for instance.
It's meaningless jargon, I suppose.
It's not meaningless. It is jargon. It has a meaning, and its intent, among other things, is to bully people into using the same jargon.
Yeah.
Cis. No one used that 7 years ago. And all of the phobias that come along with not getting this right. My point is, though, is that when the financial system, we could get into the argument, when the financial system was seen to have gone that badly wrong, and we came so close to the precipice in 2008, a whole set of things happened in the wake of it. One was that the remaining adults in the room, and there weren't many in the world, and there were very few in Canada in particular, one might note. The remaining adults in the room lost their confidence, and other people lost confidence in them. And then you see this phenomenon of the last decade of woke capitalism. And my view is that woke capitalism is explicitly a response by corporations to what went wrong in 2008. Because it instead of dealing with the issues, the systemic issues, only some of which were dealt with, and almost nobody was brought to task, as we all know, for what happened. Instead of dealing with that, you pay the votive offerings to the gods of the era. So you show people constantly that you are really tackling the diversity issue. You're really addressing the diversity issue. You're really nixing the whole implicit bias. Everyone's going through training in our office, and we've just got a black a woman of color on our board, and now we've got fewer men, and almost no one's going to be white quite soon. And You just go overboard in doing all this stuff. Why? Because it's easier than addressing the problem.
Yeah. And with the positive discrimination, you sort of bought into that. As you wrote in the book, it often only helps out those who are very privileged, rather than, I suppose, the poor kid you would expect him to from the suburb.
Well, you see, the actual diversity could take time. And more importantly, it could take effort. In fact, it always does take effort. You don't just magic it up. And the interesting thing about doing it at the speed that people are doing it at the moment is, yes, as I mentioned in the book, that you get this phenomenon of, for instance, I've had so many cases of this, and even more have come out since the book came out. So many people now sidle up to me at things and say, this is what happened with... And people who have told me themselves they've been the beneficiaries of this. Women who, for instance, have had very privileged upbringings, very privileged education, and nothing against that, it's nobody's fault, but have a very privileged education, then they happen to have been lucky enough to have been just under the cusp in the last decade. Oh, these have been good years for them. These were good years. These were good years to be of a non-white minority. Good years to have been a woman. Not that great years to have been a gay, but better than being one of those loser, straight, heterosexual know-nothings. You know? And you end up promoting the people who were just about there anyway. And that doesn't actually give you the diversity you're after. The problem, by the way, is this: that the problem we've been trying to work out is how do we make sure that anyone with a competency is not held back from achieving what they could achieve because of an inherited characteristic. And that's a perfectly reasonable aim. I mean, it seems to me that no one wants a young girl to not think she could be a physicist because most physicists in history were males. I mean, you wouldn't want any really smart young black man or woman to think they couldn't be something because most people seem to have been white who did that in the past, whatever that is. But the way we're going about this is by obsessing on these traits at the time when I thought and hoped, like a lot of people, that we were disappearing the traits. That the aim was that they became unimportant rather than that they became everything.
Well, it's quite tragic in a way. And, of course, you cite the Lincoln Memorial speech from Martin Luther King, where he, of course, famously says you should be judged by the content of your character rather than the colour of your skin.
Yeah, remember that?
Yes. And it's rather cruelly ironic how now we are so hyper-aware of each other's skin colours and sexualities and genders that we seem to have regressed almost 20 decades, or not decades, years, I suppose.
In half a century, we've shown ourselves not very good at trying to achieve that dream. I still think it remains what Dr. King said, that it remains very obviously one of the great aspirations of the human species. And there is this odd phenomenon, which I give an example in the race chapter in The Madness of Crowds, of the extent to which people have tried to unweave that dream in the belief that they are helping to fulfill it. So I cite an American academic who is a professor of whiteness studies, which is something, there's a whole conference in that on its own. And this professor of whiteness studies explains that in a speech earlier this year at Boston University, explained that people who judge people by the content of their character and not by the colour of their skin are problematic. Wow, that's a heck of a thing to undo in half a century.
So, both The Madness of the Crowds and The Strange Death of Europe are, unfortunately, deeply contentious subjects. Of course, other writers who discussed Islam in the way you did, or at least were accused of doing, for example, Salman Rushdie faced fatwas, and I think you received death threats, didn't you?
Yeah, I don't focus on this. But...
Yeah. Well, I suppose, why choose to write another book that would put you into the fray once again?
Well, I'm a writer, and I like difficult subjects.
Yeah.
I could write books about daisies and buttercups. I could write books about puppies and kittens.
Mm.
I could write pieces saying, why don't we just all get along, and can't we just love each other and sing John Lennon's horrible song, Imagine? But I don't think any of that's very interesting.
Mm.
If you're a writer or a thinker, you want to think about and write about difficult things. And our age, like every age, is laced with difficult things. You know, every age has heresies. And our own are pretty clear now. In fact, they're very clear. Well, I don't see that the job of a writer or thinker is simply to embed the heresies of the time or to enforce them. I think it's to try to interrogate them, look into them, find out what's got virtue in it and what has not, find out where you're being told lies, where you're imbibing lies. And if you find out your society is imbibing lies or doing things that are very unwise, do your bit to try to undo that. So, you know, I can't deny that when I finished The Strange Death of Europe, which, you know, was an international bestseller, came out in dozens of languages and has been cited by politicians all around the world, I was aware that I had helped to open up, I hoped I'd helped to open up a really tricky set of issues to do with immigration, Islam, identity issues, integration issues. And they're issues I've thought about for a very long time and travelled very widely and spoken to an enormous array of people to try to get to the heart of the problem. And after that, I thought, well, I'd noticed that this stuff that I focused on in The Madness of Crowds was going on. And I thought, I just want to look into this seriously. I want to read the literature and the texts, the foundations for these new ideas that have come very fast. And I want to try to understand them on their own terms. And I want to explain why I think we're deranging ourselves as societies and why the tone of our societies has become so crazed and so incredibly unpleasant. And look, everything I do them chapter by chapter in the book, as you know: gay, women, race, trans.
Yes.
And so sometimes people tell me they just look at the title page and they just shriek in horror. But I can tell you, by the way, it was an absolute walk in the park after Islam, and it doesn't bother me. I'm interested in the ideas. I'm interested in the facts. And there are always people who come along and say, how dare you, X, Y, Z. Well, how dare they tell me what to write?
Yes. The Strange Death of Europe, in particular, it was wonderfully depressing, partially because it was so well argued, I suppose. And as you said, it was cited by politicians and academics and so on. Do you think it made a lasting change to our debate or policy? Or was it shrugged off later?
It's not for me to say particularly. Others will judge that. I'm happy to be able to say that, I mean, not because of my book, but coincidental, perhaps with its publication, that the European governments stopped doing some of the absolutely insane things they'd been doing for some time. I know that various members of the German government read the book, and I got word back from some people there, and in particular, about this. You see, because what I was trying to do in that book was to say to people, and this was my experience of covering the migrant crisis of 2015, was these massive events were going on. Millions of people wanted to come to Europe, and our societies clearly couldn't cope with it. And what I wanted to do was to step back and say, why don't we ask the bigger questions about this? So, for instance, a Gallup poll from earlier this year showed that 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africa wants to move. 1/3. Now, there are some people, and there will be some in Canada you're a very long way away from all this here. Not to say you don't have your own problems with this and your own contentious debate, but here you've not got that proximity issue.
Yes.
If you had 1/3 of sub-Saharan Africa waiting on the border of Canada, I can bet you that your homegrown idiots who just say we want a borderless world would shut up a bit. I bet they would.
Yeah.
I bet they would. So I wanted to say to you, why don't you have the deeper, difficult discussions underneath this? Now, I'm glad to say that quite a lot of people took me up on that, not just readers, but others, politicians. And they have started to consider this, I hope, slightly more longer term, and ask some of the questions I invited people to ask themselves in that book. So who knows? It's always hard with ideas to know exactly where you have an impact, but I've been very pleased by the cut through that The Strange Death of Europe had all around the world. Yeah.
Mm. You are evidently quite critical of identity movements with race and gender. Mm. And yes, across the world we're seeing another sort of identity movement, which is almost fragmentation in reaction to things like the economic crash and the growing homogenization that comes with globalization. I'm wondering what gives movements like Brexit, which has to do with identity, or say Quebec separatism, or even now Wexit in Canada, legitimacy, whereas these movements don't have any?
Well, so there are not very many routes by which people can come together. There are about 4 or 5. There's religion. There's national, let's say civic. There's other beliefs. You could do it by identity groupings. There's only a few. My view is that none of them are like the ideal. I'm not saying the ideal would be if everyone was nationalists. I'm not a nationalist myself. I'm not urging that on people. Just like I'm not urging, I happen not to be a believer myself, but I'm not urging people to be religious and that would be better or something like that. And I'm certainly not urging that people should identify along identity group lines, because I think this is arguably the worst one of all for reasons we could get into. But so there's no particularly good and bad versions. I think that there are certain advantages to the ones that don't happen along identity group lines. One of the virtues of religious affiliation, for instance, is that people find themselves in proximity with people with whom they would otherwise never find themselves in proximity.
Yeah.
Your neighbor becomes potentially everybody. And there's a virtue to that I think's pretty well documented in the social sciences, apart from anything else, if you cared about them documenting anything. So I don't say there's sort of good and bad, but I think there are better and worse. And I think the interesting thing about the identity groupings one is that it's one that we have not seen weaponized like this. I mean, the idea that, for instance, all women should vote a certain way, or the gays should all have a particular view.
Yeah.
That's new. That's new. But what we're seeing, you referred to, is an awfully long way to come to talk about Brexit, but I spent a lot of my life avoiding the Brexit discussion, like I do discussion about the current American president. But I think that there have been reassertions that people are trying to interpret at the moment. There have been reassertions of something like identity, yes, that you might see in the Brexit vote, for instance. But I don't think that's primarily what that's about. I think it's one of the things it's about, yeah.
Mm. So, one of the most important themes of your book, and what was one of your diagnoses of our current society, is that we are suffering from St. George and retirement syndrome.
Yes.
Where the greatest dragon has been slain, and now, after swinging at smaller dragons, we're swinging into thin air.
Yeah.
Is that really the case? Surely there's more to be accomplished, and we need certain advocates, and God forbid even social justice advocates, to get there.
To do what?
Well, to achieve, I suppose, a society in which people aren't discriminated against.
Well, are they discriminated against in Canada at the moment?
Yes, I would say so.
Who is?
Well, if I may give an example. In Quebec, they voted for the Socialist Party. It's quite a left-wing province. And then the NDP happened to vote in a leader called Jagmeet Singh, who wore a turban. And almost immediately in the polls, and it was very, I suppose, widely seen as such, that because he happened to be a Sikh, the Quebecois would not vote for this candidate.
I don't know the case. It surprises me in some ways. I don't want to make any comment on the French-speaking areas that I'm less familiar with and what their own traits might be. In my own country, in the UK, this I think would not happen. We have, well, the second most important person in the British government, Sajid Javid, is a
of course, yeah.
son of
and Priti Patel, of course.
Priti Patel. Numerous black members of the cabinet. It's not been an issue. I think quite the reverse. I think everyone's rather proud of.
Yeah,
and that's with a Conservative government. So, if this is the case here in Canada with this particular party and this particular individual, then I suppose there are several things you have to ask. One is if the people are allowed to continue thinking that or acting in that way, and if not, how you would correct it. I'm dubious about a lot of the correction thing, by the way. I mean, can I just stress that I say in the Madness of Crowds that one of the reasons I want us to lean less heavily on some of this stuff is because it's all a little bit more complex than we're admitting.
Mm.
So it may be the case that it may be the case that, for instance, you need prominent people in prominent positions for some time to get used to people in more prominent positions. There's this annoying thing that Hillary Clinton says, if you can't see it, you can't be it, which is not true, because otherwise no one would have got to the moon. I mean, it's just, in fact, no one would have ever done anything. Anyhow. But that idea, some people have that idea that you've got to see people having got to a place in order to feel that you can get there yourself.
Yeah.
So that if nobody with a turban has got to this particular position, then nobody can. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be glib about this, but some of this stuff takes a bit of time, maybe.
Yeah.
I'm not wild about the idea. Look, give you another example. There are stats in the States that show the percentage of people in the States who wouldn't vote for a gay president or wouldn't vote for a president of Muslim origin. By the way, the largest one is they wouldn't vote for an atheist president, but park that for a moment. I just think we need to find some kind of, and again, you can be easily criticized if you're not of the group that could be said to be being discriminated against and are saying take some time. Because I recognize that for the group it doesn't feel so easy.
Mm.
But I think we have to be very careful about the sort of the idea that we need to correct the public on things. There are things we may not like, which we have to be very careful about correcting other people on. I mean, a little less certainty on some things. A case I followed recently in the States, which the Chick-fil-A controversy, which has just sprung up again the morning that we speak, is a good one. My own view is that one of the things of being in a liberal society is that you allow other people to have views which you don't like. And that's tricky. I don't by any means underestimate that. But I don't believe in the chasing out of the public sphere of everybody who doesn't have precisely the correct view that we've landed on today. I think, in fact, that when we lean on this hard, we create far more problems than we think we're solving. But anyhow, but my point is with this is, if there are issues in society you wish to address, there are ways to do this. So, for instance, the case you give, you might say, why don't we try to show people or encourage people to realize what this Sikh gentleman believes, what he doesn't believe, what Sikhs in general believe or don't believe, and the compatibility of that with the wider culture. For instance, that would seem to me, being an outsider on this case, to be a more reasonable response to it than, say, people who say the voters are racist, or the voters are bigoted, or the voters have white privilege, or something like that. Because then you're just turning on the public and telling the public they're something which they may not be. And there's a constant risk of people doing this all the time. So, for instance, what if every time a woman isn't elected to office, they can turn around and say it's because I was a woman? I mean, that's one of the tricks that Hillary Clinton pulls. No, you're a hideous candidate. Horrible, horrible candidate with terrible approval ratings. You went into the election knowing about your low approval ratings. But what if people did that all the time because they could? They could. So, as I say, my urging is that on a case-by-case basis, I try to identify, with this case maybe one, identify the things that are worth addressing. But that does not mean that we decide that there is this crusade always, and that the crusading instinct is the instinct that we should adopt.
Yes. Apart
from anything else, because who were you going to listen to tell you that the crusade might be over? Or like, time to wind it down, guys. Or at least not lean on it this hard.
Another example of St. George syndrome you bring up is with Coates in America, the author.
Ta-Nehisi Coates.
Yes.
Yeah.
And comparison to James Baldwin.
Yeah.
And where you say Baldwin, of course, wrote his time during the Jim Crow era, and his writing was absolutely necessary. Whereas Coates' writing now, he seeks to divide, and it isn't really necessary. But again, surely we need these iconoclasts to break down these barriers.
Oh no, I'm all for iconoclasts. May iconoclasts live forever. But that's not the point I'm making with comparing Coates with the great James Baldwin. It's that I'm worried about the retributive tone that's entered. And the retributive tone, the reason I find the Coates-Baldwin comparison fertile is because the retributive tone appears to be worse at the position that it has less right to be so. We see this in other areas as well. We see this, I would argue, in fourth wave feminism, where the anti-male tone is worse than it was in first, second, or third wave feminism. When it has less right to do that, in fact, let me rephrase that, less justification to do that. It has the right, has less justification to do that. Again, if the suffragettes had tried to woo people to their cause in the early part of the last century by saying men are scum, or men are trash, or another fourth wave feminist one, kill all men. Do you think that would have assisted their right to the franchise or made it a bit harder? Okay, but the suffragettes had more of a case to take on the hyper-retributive tone than fourth wave feminists do. So why now? And you can do that on all of these things. Why the unbelievable overdoing of alleged homophobia in America from the White House down now? Why now? Better than it's ever been. Better by a long way. Why is it uglier than it was in the 1970s? Why are the legacy gay groups able to whip up a hysteria which was different from the tone of the 1970s, when some degree of, not hysteria, but something like moral outrage was legitimate? That's what, taking from the great Ken Minogue, I describe as St. Georgian retirement syndrome, is that maybe we're addicted, maybe people who want to be thought of as good in our society are addicted to the St. George mode because they would like, after the hard work has been done, to be thought to have slain the dragon themselves. Maybe that's what's going on. You know, it's why we have what I've described in the past as the supply and demand problem with Nazis. You know, you have a few far-right people in Canada, we have a few in Britain. You have some crazy, ugly people who want to replay the ugliest game of the 20th century. Well, sure, but they are so fringe, and long and always may they remain so. They are so fringe that the idea that you could present them as in any way representative of or indicative of Canadian society is something you only do if you want to portray yourself as an anti-Nazi in Montreal in 2019, because you know that the people who are anti-Nazi on the beaches of Normandy in 1944 got some acclaim. And you want some of that. You want in on some of that action without having to storm any beaches or actually take any risk. But there we go.
Of course. Are you at all optimistic for the future?
Sure.
Is it getting better? Or are we going to have to live with this madness for some time yet?
Well, it's if I can narrow the question, is what getting better? I mean, on this one, or what I describe in The Madness of Crowds, I'm very optimistic. I'm very optimistic. Everything in The Strange Death of Europe was very pessimistic, because that is a heck of a conundrum there. What I write about in The Madness of Crowds, I'm very optimistic about for several reasons. One is that I'm very confident that the people I'm critiquing are in the business of overreaching. You know, one of Canada's greatest exports of recent years was the testicle waxing case. And Canada can now honestly say that it's led the world in introducing us to the idea that a bikini wax includes a testicle wax, or you're a bigot. So I'm very, very confident that they're overreaching in all of these things. And that gives me enormous pleasure and satisfaction, as well as a lot of copy. What I'm really optimistic about, glad about, is that in my observation, the really smart members of your generation are seeing through this crap and are finding your ways out. And this isn't to say that some people aren't going to remain caught up in it for a bit, but I think that the game is starting to be up. A smart young man or woman in Canada or Britain or America or anywhere else is starting, at the very least, to see through this. And they don't want to waste their lives on this. And they don't want to be told, step down, you've got the wrong skin colour, the wrong sex, you've got the wrong sexual orientation, step back, hand over to somebody else who might be as competent or might be less competent than you. Stay in your lane. I think the clever people of your generation are saying, no, we'll do what we're good at and what we think's right. Thanks awfully. And they will be fine.
Thank you, Douglas. I really appreciate speaking with you today. So where can we find your books?
You can find them online at all online booksellers, and if you can find a bookstore these days, you can find it in that. But The Madness of Crowds is out now.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much.
It's been a great pleasure.